And my teisho today is the koan, "Show me an immovable tree in a heavy wind." Show me an immovable tree in a heavy wind. I came back to this koan recently because a few weeks ago I was on a Zoom call with a group of Americans and Europeans, all of whom expressed feeling overwhelmed by political events here in the United States. This koan, "Show me an immovable tree in a heavy wind," is one that's very obviously about how one can resist certain external forces. Those forces do not have to necessarily be political ones. It could be anything. It could be a diagnosis of cancer. It could be losing your home, losing a loved one, losing your job, financial ruin. It could be anything, really. And so this koan is one that we can come back to again and again in our lives and appreciate how it is that we can be immovable in the face of very dramatic kinds of change. Now, where politics is concerned, I think this feeling that many people have of being overwhelmed by the kind of information and the amount of information about political activities in Washington is a rather dangerous state of mind. And I say this because when the mind is overwhelmed, when things are coming at it so thick and fast that there's no time to process it, then it's very difficult to prioritize. And if you can't prioritize, you cannot form a coherent plan of resistance or opposition. In other words, a populace that is overwhelmed is a populace that is rather passive. And I think that this is exactly what some politicians desire. Because if the American people are somewhat passive, they have a greater opportunity to seize unchecked power. So it's really the weaponization of chaos. Now, very often, the tradition of Buddhism has tried to remain aloof from politics, for which it has been criticized, I think, legitimately. Of course, the theory would be that if one becomes politically engaged, it is very difficult to avoid being attached to one's political actions and the outcome of those actions. And when one is attached, then one produces suffering for oneself and others. And so even when political situations really demanded that action be taken by everyone, sometimes that did not happen. But of course, Buddhism is a vast and complex, very old tradition. And so there are other examples that we can look at of engagement with politics as a matter of practice. Starting with the Buddha. There's a Jataka tale about how he intervened in a military conflict. It concerned his own clan, the Sakya clan, and another clan that were going to go to war over access to the water in the Rohini River. It was like a water rights kind of armed conflict. And the story goes that the Buddha appeared in the air above the armies as they were facing off, getting ready to do battle. He appeared in the air, and then he descended and summoned the chiefs of these two clans together and asked them, hey, look, what's more important here? The lives of your soldiers and your kinsmen, or the water? And both chiefs had to say, well, it's the lives of our soldiers and kinsmen that's more important. So when they reflected on this, they broke off, and the Buddha successfully averted an armed conflict in which everyone would have slaughtered each other. So that's a good story, but there are also real-world examples. Just think of the life, the career of Thich Nhat Hanh, who, as a very young monk, opposed the Vietnam War. He wouldn't take a side. The side he was on was the side of ahimsa, non-harming. He was on the side of the Dharma. It was a position for which he was eventually exiled. And yet he spent the rest of his life engaging in politics when necessary in order to promote the universal human value of non-harming. Even here at Great Wave Zen Sangha, we're very small, but we have what we call 8 gates of practice. And one of those gates is civic engagement. I think this is a terribly important part of what is primarily a lay Sangha. To be engaged with our communities, with our state, with our nation. Not to pretend that we are somehow separate from it. And so I think that if you have concerns about the political situation that we are in here in the United States today, that you can find ways to practice into that. You can find ways to be immovable in the face of weaponized chaos, the heavy wind. One of the ways that we can do that is by being extremely mindful of our circumstances, to keep our eyes open and to accept what it is we see for what it is, instead of trying to bend it to a particular vision of how things ought to be. Now, it does not take a psychologist to see all the evidence that points to the bullying behaviors of certain politicians. We all know that bullies are bullies because they have fears of being weak, that they fear they are inadequate. They are not intrinsically so, but they fear that they are. And so to paper over that fear of weakness or that fear of inadequacy, they choose instead to acquire power and to dominate other people. And it's quite dangerous when bullying reaches the level of national politics. It's dangerous because it demands that people be hurt. What I mean by that is this. To know that you have dominated other people requires that you hurt them. You can never be sure, if you're a bully, that you have dominated other people unless you successfully hurt them. And this they do. Their theory is that if they can dominate enough people, if their power can be complete, total, and unchecked, that they will somehow prove to themselves that they aren't the weakling they fear they are. The problem with their theory, though, is that there is always someone or some group of people that's out of their reach. There's no such thing as total power. People try to get it. They try it all the time. It has been tried again and again throughout history. And it never works. Because there's always somebody who is not subject to being dominated. Now, what that means in the short term is that bullies will double down on their bullying. They will triple down on it. They will go to greater and greater lengths and hurt more and more people and hurt them more and more severely. There can't be any end to it, you see, because it can never be completed. The whole project is destined to fail, but they have no choice but to keep trying, because for whatever reason they lack the capacity or the skill to deal with their inner fears more effectively, more productively. So I think what I'm saying is that things are likely to get worse. I hope I'm wrong about that, but I'm afraid that they're going to get worse before they get better. And so this brings us back to our immovable tree. How can you be immovable in the face of this heavy wind, a wind that is becoming ever stronger? How can you avoid being toppled, broken? Well, one way, of course, is to be firm in your political views. So you do all the traditional things that people do. You express your views. You write letters to the editor. You call your representatives. You join demonstrations. But if you do those things, and I would encourage you to do them, you have to be very careful that you not be too attached to the outcome of your actions. Because if you are, you're going to be very rigid. And it is the rigid tree that gets snapped in half in a heavy wind. I think the important thing is that we recognize the landscape for what it is, and that we adjust our expectations accordingly. Because if your expectations are aligned with reality, you will not be surprised. You will not be shocked. You will not be overwhelmed. You will not be too rigid either. And you will not be rootless because you are engaged. You see, the point of this immovable tree in a heavy wind is that it isn't frozen solid. It's flexible. It has to flex some and yet be firmly rooted. How can you do that? How can you be an unmoving tree and flexible at the same time? This is the question we have to deal with in this koan. How can you be immovable, deeply rooted, and flexible at the same time? Well, one easy intellectual answer to that question is that you sit zazen every day. That may seem like a rather passive response, but it isn't. Sitting zazen is one of the most politically radical actions a person can ever take. That was always true, and it's still true. I think the Buddha was the greatest radical that ever walked the face of the earth. When you sit every day, you're not easily knocked off your center. When you sit every day, people cannot pull the rug out from under you as easily as they used to. And I should say, it's more important to sit every day than it is to sit for a long time every few days. It's the dailiness that is the most important thing, not the number of minutes. If you only have 10 minutes, sit for 10 minutes. Sit 10 minutes every day, and the benefits will accrue. If you don't have 10 minutes, surely you have 5. I've had some people try to convince me they don't have 5 minutes. I don't believe it. But even if it's true, do you have a minute? Everybody has a minute. You can sit zazen for 1 minute every day, and the benefits will accrue. It will be better than not sitting. When we sit zazen and stabilize ourselves, it's like becoming a person walking a tightrope. It's done meticulously, poco a poco, little by little. We put one foot in front of the other. You know, the tightrope walker can't be fixated on the far end of the rope. They have to pay mindful attention to every little step they take, one after the other, very carefully, adjusting their balance and their posture in nuanced ways so that they don't fall. If they lose their concentration, they will fall. They stay right here in the here and now. And this is where we really live our lives, where we really fulfill our lives. If that is the kind of person you are, you can withstand any wind. So, immovable and flexible at the same time means that you have to plant your tree in the right kind of soil. What is that soil? Is it all sand, such that you'll be immediately uprooted in a heavy wind? No. Is it a crack in dry rock where your tree is going to wither and die? No. It has to be a more nourishing kind of soil. This is our daily practice. And when you plant your tree in that rich soil, you're going to discover something about its root. The root of your tree extends infinitely in all directions. The root of the immovable tree fills up the entire universe. All you have to do is realize this tree, and all will be well. Thank you for listening.